I learned something the hard way a couple years ago. Luxury has a funny way of making people forget where things come from. One morning I woke up and discovered that 8 cords of seasoned hardwood and nearly 600 pounds of food I'd spent months preparing for winter had been reduced to ashes, and the people responsible lived downhill from me in houses worth more than I would earn in 3 lifetimes. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 54 years old, retired from the State Forestry Service, and until that morning I'd spent most of my life believing that if you left people alone, they'd usually return the favor. Turns out that's not always true. My cabin sits on 43 acres outside a small mountain town in western Montana, high enough on the ridge that I can see sunrise hit the valley before anyone else. It's not fancy. Never wanted fancy. I have a wood stove older than some of my neighbors, a backup generator that sounds like a tractor with a hangover, a workshop built with my own hands, and enough firewood stacked every fall to get through the kind of winters that make newcomers question their life choices. A mile downhill sits Silver Creek Estates, a gated development full of glass walls, heated driveways, luxury SUVs, and people who describe camping as staying somewhere without room service. We mostly ignored each other for years. I liked it that way. The problem started when enough new residents moved in and began treating the entire valley like their private resort. The unofficial leader of that crowd was a woman named Diane Mercer, former corporate attorney, early 60s. Perfect hair, no matter the weather. The kind of person who smiled while explaining why everyone else was wrong. Diane had become president of the Homeowners Association 2 years earlier, and from what I heard, she enjoyed the position a little too much. Every few months somebody would tell me she'd complained about my truck, my generator, my workshop, or the fact that I split wood outside where people could apparently see it from one of their scenic walking trails. I always laughed it off because none of their rules applied to me. My property had been in my family since long before their development existed. My deed predated the subdivision by decades. Legally speaking, they had about as much authority over me as a random guy at a gas station. Then came the morning everything changed. I remember it clearly because it was cold enough that my coffee steamed like a locomotive. I walked outside planning to haul another load of firewood closer to the porch before a storm rolled through. Instead, I stopped dead in my tracks. Where my woodshed should have been, there was a black patch of ground covered in wet gray ash. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then I noticed the twisted metal roof panels, the charred posts, and the empty racks. 8 cords of oak and maple, all gone. My stomach dropped. I ran toward the storage cellar next. The lock had been cut. Inside, shelves stood nearly empty. Smoked venison, canned vegetables, dried fruit, winter supplies I'd spent months preparing gone. Not stolen. Removed. There was a difference, and somehow that difference made me even angrier. Hanging from the fence near the road was a laminated notice secured with zip ties. I can still picture it. Bright white paper. Official-looking logo. Lots of bold print. According to the document, my firewood and food storage area had been removed due to a community safety violation involving combustible materials and improper storage practices. At the bottom sat Diane Mercer's signature. I actually laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny, because it was so unbelievably arrogant that my brain couldn't decide whether to be furious or impressed. Someone had driven onto my property, cut locks, destroyed thousands of dollars worth of supplies, and left me paperwork explaining why I should be grateful. I drove into town that afternoon carrying the notice. First stop was the sheriff's office. Deputy Mark Benson listened quietly while I explained everything. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Let me guess," he said. "Silver Creek Estates?" I nodded. He nodded back. Neither of us needed to say much after that. Apparently, I wasn't the first person to have issues with them. The problem was proving exactly who authorized the destruction. Civil matter. Property dispute. Lawyers love those words. Normal people hated them. On the drive home, I kept thinking about Diane. Not the paperwork. Not the money. The attitude behind it. Somewhere along the line, she'd convinced herself she had authority she didn't actually possess. And people like that rarely stop until reality forces them to. That night, I sat on my porch watching lights shimmer across the valley. Down below, Silver Creek's artificial lake reflected hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of landscaping lights. Homeowners strolled around the shoreline. Fountains sprayed into the air. Everything looked peaceful. Then something my grandfather once told me drifted back into my memory. When I was a kid, he'd pointed toward that valley and said, Never forget, son, water decides who stays and who leaves. At the time I thought he was talking about droughts. Sitting there in the darkness, I suddenly wondered if he'd meant something else entirely. The next morning I drove to the county records office and started digging through old maps, survey documents, water permits, and land records. And before lunchtime, I found something that made me set my coffee down and stare at the file for nearly a full minute, because hidden inside decades of paperwork was a piece of forgotten history that explained exactly why Silver Creek Estates existed at all. The next morning, I walked into the county records office expecting to find a few old maps and maybe some background information I could hand over to a lawyer. What I found instead changed everything. An older clerk named Harold recognized my last name almost immediately. "Cole," he asked, adjusting his glasses. "Any relation to Walter Cole?" I smiled. "My grandfather." Harold nodded and disappeared into a back room. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a stack of records thick enough to stop a door. For the next several hours, I sat at a wooden table flipping through yellowed surveys, water permits, easement agreements, engineering reports, and handwritten notes dating back nearly 70 years. That's when I discovered something Silver Creek Estates had apparently forgotten, or maybe hoped nobody would remember. Long before luxury homes, golf carts, and homeowners association meetings, there had been a small ranch operation in that valley. Back in the late 1940s, my grandfather built a stone diversion structure along a mountain creek to help regulate seasonal runoff. It wasn't glamorous, just solid craftsmanship from an era when people built things to survive. Over time, the diversion channel created a reliable water source that eventually became the lake sitting at the center of Silver Creek Estates. The development brochures called it a private lake. The marketing materials described it as a natural centerpiece. The reality was much simpler. The lake existed because my family's water infrastructure allowed it to exist. Then I found the document that really caught my attention. About 30 years earlier, when the subdivision was first approved, my father had signed a temporary access arrangement allowing controlled water flow into the future lake. No permanent transfer, no ownership change, no surrender of rights, just a handshake-style agreement between neighbors. It renewed several times over the decades. Then I noticed something important. The last renewal had expired over a year ago. There was no replacement agreement, no active contract, nothing. I read the file 3 times just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. Legally speaking, Silver Creek Estates had been operating on habit rather than authority. They'd simply gotten used to the water being there. The drive home felt different. Not angry, focused. For days I'd been thinking about revenge. Now I was thinking about accountability. Those are 2 very different things. Revenge is emotional. Accountability requires paperwork. A week later, I met with a water rights consultant in town named Rick Alvarez. Rick spent 40 years dealing with Western water law and looked exactly like the kind of guy who knew every creek, ditch, and reservoir in 3 counties. He reviewed the documents, leaned back in his chair, and let out a low whistle. "Ethan," he said, "do the HOA folks know this?" "I don't think so." He chuckled. "Then they're about to have a very educational experience." Before doing anything, I followed every legal step available. I filed maintenance notifications. I documented the condition of the old diversion gate. I photographed everything. I submitted inspection paperwork. Every form was completed correctly. Every deadline was observed. I wasn't interested in surprises. I wanted a clean record. 3 days later, I stood beside the old stone structure my grandfather had built decades earlier. Moss-covered portions of the rockwork. Pine needles drifted across the water. The iron control wall looked ancient but solid. I rested my hand on the metal and thought about all the years my family had quietly maintained something most people didn't even know existed. Then I started turning. The wheel groaned like it hadn't moved in years. Water shifted direction slowly at first, then faster. Instead of feeding the channel leading towards Silver Creek Estates, a significant portion began returning to the original creek bed downstream. Perfectly legal, fully documented, entirely within my rights. Then I went home and waited. Day 1 passed quietly. Day 2 was different. Around lunchtime, I drove into town for supplies and noticed several residents gathered along the shoreline. Even from the road, I could see the difference. Water levels had dropped noticeably. One dock sat at an awkward angle. The decorative fountain near the center of the lake wasn't spraying as high as usual. Nobody seemed panicked yet, mostly confused. By the following morning, the confusion had turned into concern. The lake had dropped even farther. Mud appeared along portions of the shoreline. Boats sat lower than normal. Aeration systems worked overtime trying to compensate. Homeowners began asking questions. Questions eventually reached the HOA board. Questions eventually reached Diane Mercer. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered anyway. "Mr. Cole," a woman's voice asked. "This is Diane Mercer." I leaned back in my chair. "Hello, Diane." There was a pause. "We've noticed some unusual water conditions affecting the community lake." "Have you?" Another pause, slightly longer this time. "Our maintenance contractor believes the source may involve your diversion structure." "Interesting." Her tone tightened. "We'd appreciate your cooperation in restoring normal flow." I looked out the window toward the valley below. Why would I do that? Silence. Not because she lacked an answer. Because she suddenly realized the answer wasn't very good. The conversation ended a few minutes later without accomplishing much. She expected compliance. I expected accountability. Those positions weren't exactly compatible. By day, the situation escalated dramatically. Water levels had dropped several feet. Large sections of shoreline were exposed. Residents were posting photographs online. Realtors quietly started canceling showings. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some homeowners assumed there was a leak. Others blamed drought conditions. A few suspected mechanical failure. Then Diane arrived at my cabin in person. I heard her vehicle before I saw it. A brand new luxury SUV climbed my gravel driveway and stopped near the workshop. Diane stepped out dressed like she was heading into a board meeting rather than a mountain property. She marched directly toward me. "This has gone far enough," she said before even saying hello. "Has it?" I replied. "The community is suffering significant damages." I nodded. "I know how that feels." Her expression hardened. "If you're responsible for this, we will pursue every legal option available." I couldn't help smiling. Legal options? That's an interesting topic coming from someone whose organization trespassed on private property, cut locks, destroyed supplies, and left violation notices on land you don't control. Diane opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since arriving, she looked uncertain. I walked inside and returned carrying a folder. Then I handed it to her. Inside were photographs of the burned woodshed, inventory records, cost estimates, property damage assessments, water rights documentation, contract history, everything. She flipped through page after page as the color slowly drained from her face. Finally, she reached the final section. The proposed settlement. Compensation for destroyed property. Payment for future water access. Formal recognition of existing rights. Protective restrictions against future interference. Diane stared at the numbers for several seconds. Then she laughed. Not because she found them funny. Because she couldn't believe she was reading them. "You're serious?" she asked. "Completely. This is ridiculous." "No," I said quietly. "Burning a man's winter supply because you think you're above the law was ridiculous. This is simply the bill." She tossed the folder back toward me and turned for her vehicle. Before climbing inside, she looked over her shoulder. "We'll see what the attorneys say." Then she drove away. I watched the dust settle behind her SUV and honestly felt calmer than I had since this whole thing began. Because for the first time, the argument wasn't about opinions anymore. It was about leverage, and the one thing Silver Creek Estates desperately needed was still flowing through a gate controlled by me. By the 7th day, the lake barely looked like a lake anymore. What had once been the centerpiece of Silver Creek Estates now looked like a forgotten construction site. The shoreline had retreated so far that old tree stumps and rusted metal debris were sticking out of the mud like buried secrets finally coming up for air. The fountains were silent. The docks leaned at awkward angles. Real estate agents had stopped bringing buyers through the neighborhood because nobody wanted to pay luxury home prices for a view of cracked mud and mosquito swarms. I wasn't celebrating exactly, but I won't pretend I wasn't satisfied. Every time I looked at that empty basin, I thought about the pile of ashes where my winter supplies used to be. I thought about the months of labor that had disappeared because somebody in an HOA office decided they were in charge of property that wasn't theirs. The difference was simple. What I had done was legal. What they had done wasn't. Around noon on the 7th day, I heard tires crunching up my driveway again. This time there were 3 vehicles instead of 1. Diane stepped out first, but she looked different. Gone was the confident smile she'd worn during our last meeting. Gone was the attitude. Behind her stood a property manager and a lawyer carrying a thick folder. For a moment, nobody spoke. The wind moved through the pine trees overhead, and somewhere down the hill, a hawk cried out. Finally, Diane cleared her throat. "Mr. Cole," she said, "we'd like to resolve this." I almost laughed at the choice of words. Resolve this. As if the whole thing had been some unfortunate misunderstanding instead of a disaster they had created themselves. The lawyer handed me a packet. Inside was everything I demanded. Compensation for the destroyed firewood. Compensation for the food storage. Reimbursement for damages. Prepaid water access fees. New annual payments going forward. Written acknowledgement of my water rights. Construction restrictions near my property line. Mandatory permission requirements for trail access across my land. And perhaps my favorite clause of all, if the association trespassed again, interfered with my property again, or violated any part of the agreement, I retained the right to suspend water flow after proper notice. They had gone from acting like rulers of the valley to signing paperwork that effectively recognized reality. Diane watched me read each page. "Well?" she finally asked. I looked up. "Looks fair." Her shoulders dropped slightly. Not relief exactly. More like exhaustion. The kind people feel when they spend days fighting a battle they already know they've lost. We signed the documents at my kitchen table. No dramatic speeches. No shouting. No revenge movie ending. Just signatures on paper and the quiet sound of consequences arriving right on schedule. The following morning, I walked back to the old stone diversion gate. The iron wool felt cold under my hands. Slowly, I turned it. Water rushed through the channel once more, sparkling in the sunlight as it flowed towards Silver Creek Estates. Within hours, the lake began rising. Within days, the shoreline returned. Within weeks, the fountains were running again, and the neighborhood looked like the glossy brochure version of itself. But things had changed. Every homeowner knew exactly where that water came from now. Every board member knew it too. And perhaps most importantly, Diane knew it. A few months later, I ran into one of the residents at the hardware store. Nice guy. We'd barely spoken before everything happened. He shook my hand and said something that stuck with me. "You know," he said, "most of us had no idea how any of that worked. We just assumed the lake was always there." I nodded. That's usually the problem. Because that's what this whole story was really about. Not water. Not contracts. Not even the HOA. It was about people forgetting where things come from. Electricity comes from somebody maintaining lines. Roads come from somebody repairing them. Water comes from somebody protecting the source. Luxury has a way of hiding the labor underneath it. And when people stop seeing that labor, they start taking it for granted. Sometimes they even start believing they're entitled to it. Today, the lake is full again. Silver Creek Estates is still there. Diane retired from the board not long afterward. As for me, I rebuilt my woodshed, restocked my cellar, and went back to enjoying the quiet. But every now and then, when I sit on my porch at sunset and look down at that sparkling lake, I remember how quickly it disappeared, and how quickly attitudes changed when it did. Now here's what I'd like to know from you. Did I go too far, or was it the only language people like that were ever going to understand? If someone destroyed months of your work and acted like they had every right to do it, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling this is one of those stories where nobody agrees on where justice ends and revenge begins.